So our boy Jon Favreau did an interview recently where he talked about the future of the Filoniverse and also all the other shows that he will be producing and involved in regarding Star Wars. He was also asked about the sequel trilogy in this interview, in which he responded in a very open way, and I was actually surprised at how open he was about it, and I respect it a lot. But I think what Jon says about the future of all the shows that he will be involved in Star Wars will surprise you a lot. Let's get into it. So the first paragraph in this article talks about the pitch that Jon Favreau actually gave to Kathleen Kennedy and also all the other heads of Lucasfilm. And in this first quote, Jon Favreau talks about how he had a pitch for following the archetypes that influenced George Lucas. And they've said this many times in the making of documentary that The Mandalorian isn't an homage to Star Wars, it's an homage to the things that influenced Star Wars. And that is why it feels so much like the original Star Wars and why it feels like home to us. Because at the end of the day, the original trilogy wasn't paying homage to Star Wars because there was no Star Wars before it. The original trilogy paid homage to things that influenced Star Wars, things that inspired George Lucas, and that's exactly what The Mandalorian is doing. So that's why The Mandalorian is so good to us, but moving on. Now this part of the interview might shock a lot of people, and it's the part that I find the most interesting. When Favreau was asked about whether the return of Luke Skywalker as seen in the season 2 finale was always planned out, he answered, "No, the story unfolded as I wrote it. The Mandalorian inherits a great deal from existing Star Wars stories, and when I write it, that context is always a consideration." So a lot of people might gasp at this and freak out because once again, Disney Star Wars has no plan for the future. But if you go watch this George Lucas interview that I may link down in the description if I can find it, he talks about the original trilogy and talks about how he had absolutely no plan. Yeah, he might have had an overall outline, but a lot of big story beats were changed as they were writing the scripts for each movie. He even says in the interview the key is to act like you had a plan the whole time. George had no idea what he was doing when he was going into episodes 5 and 6. But as long as Dave Filoni and Jon Favreau have an overall understanding of where they want to go with all of these stories, and they keep taking inspiration from the existing Star Wars stories as he said, I think they'll be fine and they'll continue making content that is top tier like The Mandalorian. He was then asked in a follow-up question whether he felt pinned in narratively given the sequel trilogy reveals Luke's future, and he replied with, "We have a tremendous amount of freedom afforded to us because of the gap in time between the film." He then says Dave Filoni and I are in constant discussion regarding how each story choice is impacted by and would impact existing Star Wars material. The article goes on to remind us that before The Mandalorian Season 1 was even released, Jon Favreau did tell us that the show would explore the origins of the First Order. So that was a pretty obvious tell that Jon Favreau was telling us that the show would connect to the sequel trilogy in some ways. The rest of the interview is pretty much just Jon Favreau talking about his writing process for The Mandalorian and the other shows that he is writing for, and he says that audience feedback is actually a big part in the way he writes his stories. He says that because of the world that we live in with streaming, there's a pretty much instant feedback loop. He says because of the instant feedback loop that we have nowadays, as soon as he gets that feedback, he goes back and he changes things he already has written, as well as takes it into consideration for the future. And I think that's pretty interesting, and I think that is a big reason why his writing is so successful for The Mandalorian. But what I really wanted to talk about in this video is the connection of the Filoniverse to the sequel trilogy. Now yes, Jon Favreau has stated over and over again, as well as in this interview, that the Mandalorian and the Filoniverse shows will connect to the sequel trilogy. But I think they can go about this in two separate ways. They can go the route of retconning the sequel trilogy with the world between worlds or in other ways, or straight up just retconning it, or they can go the route of adding to the sequel trilogy, adding to the storylines, and making it better. Now, which one would I rather? I would rather them just retcon the sequel trilogy and allow Jon Favreau and Dave Filoni to play in that era, because I think they can make that era very good. It had a lot of potential. The Force Awakens was a great setup, but the execution after The Force Awakens is where it really flopped. And I think if you give Jon Favreau and Dave Filoni the opportunity to make a trilogy of movies set in that time period with those actors and those characters, I think they can do something very special and maybe even make the best Star Wars that we've ever seen. But that's just a hope I have, and I don't think that's actually going to happen. I think what's more likely to happen is that Jon Favreau and Dave Filoni will connect these shows to the sequel trilogy and make the sequel trilogy even better. And what I mean by that is they'll add to the storylines for the characters that we already know. They'll add to Luke's storyline, they'll add to Snoke's storyline, they'll actually give Snoke a backstory, that type of stuff. I don't think they'll go in and retcon things with the world between worlds or anything like that. I don't think we will see the sequel trilogy era Luke that we all wanted to see ever. I think the sequel trilogy Luke will always be the hermit that we saw in the sequel trilogy, and I don't think Jon and Dave even want to touch that. Jon talks about in the interview how he has a lot of freedom in the time period that they're playing in right now, and I think Jon wants to stay in that time period because of the freedom that he has afforded during that time. Jon wants to be able to tell his own stories and maybe enhance the future movies a little bit, but he wants to be able to play in his own sandbox. He doesn't want to be held back by retconning the sequel trilogy storyline. He doesn't want to be tasked with doing any of that stuff. He wants to just create his own stories that he knows will work. And while I would love the sequel trilogy to be retconned and for them to start over with Jon and Dave at the helm, I don't think that's going to happen. And to be honest with you, I'm not that big of a sequel trilogy hater, so I don't mind that decision too much, because I do think retconning the sequel trilogy would alienate a lot of the newer fans, and I'm not really about that stuff. I think if you're a huge sequel trilogy fan, you should just be allowed to like the sequel trilogy. But back to Jon Favreau, as I said before, I don't think he'll be retconning the sequel trilogy. As he said in this interview, these shows from the Filoniverse will be connecting to the sequel trilogy, and I just think they'll use the shows from the Filoniverse to enhance the sequel trilogies when there's obvious opportunities to do so. I don't think any storylines from the sequel trilogy will ever be fundamentally changed, but I do think Jon and Dave are looking to enhance them where they can. But let me know what you think of all the stuff that Jon Favreau said in this interview. He actually said some very interesting things, even outside of the sequel trilogy stuff. I think the stuff that he said about the audience influencing his writing a lot is very interesting to me, and while I do think that's a big reason for The Mandalorian's writing being so good, I do think that's a very slippery slope. If you start letting the audience influence your writing too much, the stories could become very convoluted and confusing, but Jon Favreau is very experienced and I'm sure he knows all that stuff already. But once again, let me know what you guys think about all this stuff in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, consider checking out some of my other content and subscribing to the channel, and also leave a like on the video. If you want to find me on all my socials, the links will be in the description as well as the link to the Discord. But other than that, thanks for watching the video and hope to see you on the next one.